In the last video, we talked about Athens in the late 5th century BCE, and we essentially concluded that while it was still the cultural jewel of Greece, it was now reeling from a crushing defeat in the Peloponnesian War. We essentially saw a city that had lost its empire, that had lost its naval power and also its confidence at the same time. We talked about its political system, how it gave its citizens a sense of ownership, but also how it could be widely unstable and unpredictable. We also saw how that the reliance on oratory created a perfect market for the Sophists, who essentially sold the art of persuasion without really worrying much about the truth. And we ended the video with the conclusion that this was the Athens Plato grew up in. It was a city where power often went to the most convincing speaker or orator, and not to the most capable leader. Now, in this kind of political climate, Socrates stood out like a sore thumb, because he didn't give rousing speeches in the assembly, nor did he spend any real time training young men to win in any debate. In fact, he didn't even seem interested in winning in a debate at all, since he believed that if you were going to make decisions about justice, about courage, or about virtue, then you'd better be able to explain what those things are exactly. And not just in a way that sounded nice or aspirational, but in a way that could stand up to serious questioning. And this is what made Socrates ultimately different from the Sophists, because the Sophists just gave people the tools to sound convincing, while Socrates wanted people to actually be correct. So if we want to understand why Socrates became such a defining figure for Plato, then we need to first see him as he was in his daily life. We need to see him not as the polished and wise figure that was later carved into statues, but as the unusual and often very puzzling guy in the city. In other words, Socrates during that time was literally a menace, because not only did he not dress like a man of, let's say, influence, he often just went barefoot, and he showed little interest on the usual signs of status and wealth. So while Athenian politicians were busy managing their image, Socrates was more likely to be seen standing in the marketplace, barefoot at that, lost in his own thoughts, and just simply stopping random people to ask them questions that almost no one really was prepared to answer. And when I say questions, I don't really mean like the polite kind of conversational starters. Because if you were a general, he might directly ask you what courage really is, and the answer he wants from you is never really just like a random example from a single battle or a historic example. What he actually wanted from you more often than not was an actual definition that could be applied to every possible situation that concerns courage. And if you were a religious authority, for example, he might then press you on what piety truly means, and whether something is considered pious because the gods love it, or whether the gods love it because it is pious. And if you were a politician talking about justice, then Socrates wouldn't just settle for some noble or idealized slogan. He'll keep asking and probing until your reasoning tied itself into knots and or broken down altogether. Now, this form of relentless inquiry is essentially what we nowadays call the Socratic method, and it worked by breaking down false certainty. Now, Socrates believed that most people's problem isn't really that they just simply lacked knowledge in the first place. He believed that their actual problem was that they thought they knew more than they actually knew. To him, that illusion was actually more dangerous, especially for the people who are in positions of power. So he saw it as his job to strip away that false confidence, even if that meant making people uncomfortable during the process. But the problem of this approach, especially in a city like Athens, and in particular like the one we talked about in the first episode, in this kind of city, in this kind of Athens, public image mattered a whole lot. Because, as we now know, politics during that time was built on persuasion, and reputation was literally everything for a politician. By the way Socrates was questioning people, it had a way of puncturing people's reputation right there in public, and often or not in front of an audience, that would then laugh or murmur as a supposedly wise man or general failed to answer the very basic questions about his own area of expertise. So, as you could imagine, this didn't really win him many friends among the powerful people in the city. And the thing you have to understand is that Socrates, he didn't only pick some safe targets to question either. He would challenge anyone. He is like a mad dog. He would challenge celebrated poets. He would challenge famous generals, battle-proven generals, or even wealthy patrons. He would basically challenge people who were used to being respected and not really interrogated on the street by a randomer who currently is not wearing any shoes. And because of this kind of public questioning, the embarrassment that followed the questioning was often enough to turn whatever little admiration these powerful people had for Socrates into outright hostility. And once that hostility took root, it didn't really fade away quickly, since powerful people, like a lot of us, we often remember being made to look like a complete fool in public. So they naturally weren't really inclined to just simply forgive Socrates or let it slide. Now, as you could imagine, this kind of growing resentment would have been dangerous in any normal political climate. But remember that the Athens we are talking about here wasn't really any normal political climate. As we said before, the city had literally just been through a long and exhausting and humiliating war. It had seen its democracy overthrown by an oligarchic coup, and had only recently restored its political stability somewhat. The whole atmosphere, the whole political atmosphere, was essentially extremely tense and suspicious, and people in general were just looking for maybe a bit more predictability and a bit more stability. And in that kind of atmosphere, Socrates, who was still constantly questioning, asking hard questions and refusing to back down, this kind of person really started to look less like just a harmless philosopher asking questions, and he started looking a lot more like an increasingly destabilizing force. Athens wanted order. It wanted a return to steady governance. And then there was still Socrates, still in the marketplace, still asking hard and awkward questions, and still trying to push people to admit that they didn't know what they were talking about in public. Now, for some people, he was still a model for integrity, but for a lot of other people, he was a problem that needed solving. So, when the charges of impiety and corrupting the youth, when they were finally brought against him, they were less about any specific let's say, transgression or crime that he had committed, and more about how a city like Athens during that time could coexist with someone who essentially challenged the very way it decided what was true and what was right. And this is the thing we have to think about next, because how Socrates actually answered this accusation of impiety and corruption of the youth in court, and how he handled his own defense, this tells us almost everything about why Plato actually saw him as the kind of person who should be leading the city. But at the same time, also why the city couldn't really tolerate him anymore doing what he was doing. And this tension, the tension between wisdom and a political system's inability to handle wisdom, is exactly what will push Plato toward the ideal of the philosopher king. Now, when the trial of Socrates finally began, he didn't walk in and start begging for his life or try to smooth things over with the powerful people. That just really wasn't who he was. And here you also have to understand that the charges were serious enough to actually carry the death penalty. But to him, the real issue here wasn't the actual verdict. To him, the real issue was the truth. He wasn't there to charm the jury or to say whatever they wanted to hear to save his own life. He was there to explain why he acted the way he did, and why he ultimately wasn't about to stop, even if they don't sentence him to death. So, he told the jury that his style of questioning actually came from a kind of divine mission. According to him, the oracle at Delphi had once declared that no man was wiser than Socrates. And he told the jury that at first he didn't believe it. He thought that it must be a mistake. So he basically set out to find someone that is wiser than himself. He went to politicians, he went to poets, he went to generals, or literally everyone or anyone who had a reputation for knowledge, and he questioned them. And time after time, question after question, he discovered that while they knew many things in their own fields, they often believed that they knew more than they actually did. So, the difference between them and him, he said, was that he knew that he didn't know everything, and that this, paradoxically, actually made him wiser than all of them combined. This was basically the heart of his defense. He argued that he wasn't corrupting the youth, he was just encouraging them to think to think critically, to examine themselves, and to care more about the state of their soul and truth and justice than about wealth or reputation. And as for the impiety charge, he argued that his whole life was actually simply an act of obedience to a divine calling, which was that prophecy, and that by questioning and testing people incessantly, he was serving the God who had actually given him this task. Now, for us, all of this might sound somewhat noble and also perhaps just a bit out there, right? But to the jury of the 500 Athenians, many of them who had seen decades of war, who had seen decades of political chaos and betrayal, this sounded like a man who was refusing to back down, even when his own life was at stake. And that is exactly what it was. So, after he was, unsurprisingly, found guilty of the charges, he had the option to propose his own punishment as an alternative under the Athenian system during that time. And while most people in his position would probably suggest exile or a heavy fine so that they could actually avoid the death penalty, Socrates famously suggested that he should be rewarded instead. Instead of getting put to death, he should actually be given free meals in the Prytaneum, which is essentially the public dining hall for honored citizens of Athens. Because, in his view, he had actually spent his whole life, benefiting the city and fulfilling a divine mission. Now, that, of course, didn't go over well. The jury, now essentially irritated by his defiance, voted for the death penalty. And following the verdict, even after his friends had arranged for a way for him to escape and live in exile, he still refused. Because to him, fleeing now would have undermined every single thing he had ever stood for, which was respect for the law, respect for integrity, and also living according to principle rather than fear. So he stayed, and he ultimately drank the hemlock. Now for Plato, this was the moment that proved his point about Athens. Here was a man who had spent his life trying to improve the city by making its citizens wiser and more self-aware. And now the system had decided to execute him. And it executed him not because he actually did something wrong, but simply because the city itself couldn't really handle being challenged in that way anymore. And this, to Plato, showed that political systems, if they are left to themselves, whether they are democratic, whether they're oligarchic or anything else, if these systems were left to themselves, they would eventually turn against real wisdom, unless they were deliberately reshaped to protect it. And this is where the seeds of the Philosopher King were planted, because if Socrates was the only man in Athens who truly understood justice, yet Athens chose to silence him and put him to death, then Plato's question became, how do you actually put someone like Socrates in charge rather than on trial? And this was the problem he was going to spend the rest of his life trying to solve. Now in the next episode, we are going to start talking about Plato's own philosophy. And we'll be starting with his theory of forms, which is essentially the idea that there are eternal and unchanging truths beyond the shifting opinions of the crowd. And we do this, and we start here, because in order to understand why Plato actually saw the Philosopher King as necessary, we must first understand what kind of truth he actually believed such rulers should know.